Hello everyone and welcome back to the Forge. This is Marshall, and today's video is going to be kind of a stupid experiment. About a year ago, I was running low on steel, and I thought I had just enough to kind of put together a Damascus stack. And as you can see, I've got some thicker, I don't even know what thickness that is, some thicker pieces of 1084 and some really thin, almost sheet metal thickness 15N20. And I welded this together rather haphazardly. And then I thought better of it. I ended up getting some new steel and I just kind of threw this on the bench and it's been sitting there building up rust. But I haven't had the heart to throw it away because I've been wondering if I can make that stick. Normally you clean these. I did clean these surfaces off before I welded them, but I'm sure the surface rust is not only on the outside, but I'm sure there's rust in between those layers. I'm just curious to see what will happen if I try to squish this all together. I'm just curious if it'll stick or how bad can this get before it's unworkable. So, just to satisfy my curiosity and I guess for entertainment purposes, let's see what happens. Stick around. As we're bringing this up to welding temperature, we want to make sure that we minimize the amount of oxygen buildup in between these layers. So I'm just using a little borax and a wire brush here to help with that. Other than this stack being kind of a hot mess from the start, I'm really going about this just like I normally would any other billet. It's kind of a cold day, but really just anytime you're using the hydraulic press, you can draw a lot of heat out of your billet quickly because of the amount of contact time in between these plates. So I like to take the blowtorch to it before I put my stack in there just to help with that, help minimize that heat draw. As you can see, I'm just kind of alternating between my power hammer and the hydraulic press with different dies on there, trying to find that compromise between drawing out and flattening and pressing as we go. I don't really know what the precedent is for any of this. This billet was really a hot mess before we got started, so a lot of this I'm just kind of playing by ear. It's definitely important to make sure you get your arm in the way of every important shot as you go along when you're making these videos. That's a pro tip. The main thing is that everything seems to be holding together pretty well. I was kind of surprised at this point. I really
I wouldn't have been shocked if there was a failure, but everything's stuck. Flattened out pretty nicely. We just keep moving with this. I'm putting a little bit of a ladder pattern in here. Very subtle. I'm not trying to go too crazy with this. Really, again, just trying to see if this can work at all. So I'm not focused too much on making an elaborate pattern. I like low layer Damascus patterns anyway. I just think they look pretty cool. And this is about as simple as it gets. So if you look carefully there, even before we put it into the ferric chloride to etch, you can see the pattern showing through just a little bit. Of course, this is after we take it out. I just wanted to see what we were dealing with, and the etch is also a really good way to spot flaws in the metal. It'll show up a lot better after you put it through the etch. This looks like a pretty solid piece of steel. Again, the pattern is pretty unspectacular, but once you start to put the bevels in there, it'll add some subtle complexities to it. So far, so good. So I've decided to go with a sort of drop nose hunter profile on this one. At least that's what I'm calling it. If you have a better name for what this shape is, then feel free to put it in the comments. And I'm going to do a hollow grind for the bevels. You can see I've already started here a little bit before I had the camera rolling. Sorry about that, but you didn't miss much. You get the idea. I like hollow grinds a lot. It's kind of my go-to for bevels, but it does add a little bit of a complication when you're working with Damascus, because if you want to finish sand and you really want to show off the pattern in those bevels, it's a little harder because you have to sand into the contour of the bevel itself with that radius. There are some tricks to it, some tools you can use to make that easier. It's also kind of hard to keep that line where the bevel goes into the flat part of the side of the blade as it goes up towards the spine, as opposed to when you have a flat bevel and you can just take a bar stock or whatever you use for flat sanding. That's a lot easier, but we'll get into that a little bit more later in the video. As you can see, I'm just kind of warming up my quench oil here. This is the quickest and easiest way I know how to do it. I like to get up to about 130 degrees before I do my quench. In she goes. As the blade is tempering in the kiln, I'm stabilizing some walnut scales. I have a lot of this walnut in the shop, and I just love working with natural wood, so that'll be happening in the background. And now I'm just taking my carbide tipped hammer and working out a slight bend that showed up after I pulled it out of the tempering oven. Those carbide tip hammers work really great. A little tedious, takes a while, but it'll get the bend out. Now you can see I've got my benchmark on this blade, but this was the first time I had actually used that particular stamp, and I guess I just didn't hit it hard enough. As I started going through the hand sand process, I noticed that I was actually sanding into the benchmark, and it started to look goofy, so I finally just decided to sand it off entirely. I'd rather have no benchmark than one that looks half-assed. So that's what I did. And then we move into the hand sanding process, and this is me for many days. As you can see, I just go back and forth between sanding in the contour of the bevel and sanding up on the flats. I also have a little tool that I use. It's just a piece of metal that I've cut and shaped to match the radius of my 14-inch wheel on my belt grinder, and that works really well for getting into the hollow grind bevels as well. I bring it up to about 600 grit here. At least I think that's where we're at here, before I put it back in the etch just to take a look and see where we're at. Eventually I'd go up to about 1,000 on this blade. Well, look at that. We have a pattern welded blade with no cold shunts and no delaminations. None that I can see anyway. Good hardened steel. I think this is going to turn out to be a really beautiful and functional blade. I like these low layer, high contrast Damascus patterns. It's not elaborate or fancy in any way, shape, or form, but I just think they look great. Really pleased with the way this turned out, considering all the things that I did that you're not supposed to do when putting together a stack. I'm very pleasantly surprised. Moving into the final stretch now with our handle material using our stabilized walnut, and I'm going to put some green and black liners in there as well. Just applying a little tung oil here to make the pattern pop in the grain. I'm still going to sand quite a bit more after this, up to about 800 grit. But I think tung oil is really the only finish I put on this blade. I put a few layers of it on, let it dry, and sand, and then add more. It fills gaps really nicely. It gives it a nice smooth finish, and it really brings out the color of the wood. I like tung oil for pretty much any hardwood. Well, this video started with sort of a question mark. Will this work? Considering this Damascus has really just kind of come out of the scrap heap. I guess here's the answer. Yes, I think we ended up with a really beautiful blade. Despite all the quote-unquote mistakes that were made going into the process, I guess we came out all right. I hope you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making this video. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the field below and I'll definitely get back to you. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks again.
Thank you.